Your questions, everyone. So next up, we have Robert Mattson. He is a senior environmental scientist at St. John's River Water Management District. He has been involved in monitoring, research, and management of Florida springs, rivers, and estuaries for 35 years. And Robert, take it away. Thank you.
All righty, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. And you see my title slide.
Yes.
So yeah, glad to be here. Wish we could be down there together, but still glad to be able to talk to everybody. So we'll start with a really quickie overview of the springs of Volusia County. Of course, we've already talked a little bit about Blue Spring and De Leon and Gemini. We've also got Green Springs on the north shore of Lake Monroe. Also Seminole Spring, which is in a private subdivision, pretty highly modified, but it's listed in all of the Springs of Florida publications. And I've seen references to an Enterprise Spring and a Benson or a Benson Mineral Spring also on the north shore of Lake Monroe. I think the Benson Spring was tapped and was used as the water supply for the power plant that used to be there. But those are the springs of Volusia County, and we've touched a little bit on springs magnitude, which is one of the ways we classify springs. The largest are the first mag, greater than 100 cubic feet per second, and that's Blue Spring. De Leon, also called Ponce de Leon in some of the older literature, and Gemini are second mag, and you can see there on the right there, their average annual discharge. Green Springs just makes it as a third mag, and a very little bit of data on Seminole. It appears to be down there about a fifth magnitude or so. So that's one of the ways we describe springs, is by their flow. Another way is by their base water quality, the composition of the dissolved salts and minerals in the spring water. And there are a few different schemes for classifying Florida springs. This one is from a University of Florida master's thesis some years ago, 4 basic types from low ion or soft water to salt springs. Most of the springs, this is Water Management District data, most of the Volusia County springs are salt springs, pretty high dissolved solids concentration. Blue, Gemini, Green, and Seminole are all salt springs. De Leon, let me see if I can do my laser pointer here. De Leon here is a mixed spring. And the reason this is because the St. John's River used to be a coastal lagoon like the Indian River Lagoon system. And so it's underlain by this layer of relict or ancient seawater. And that's why we've got these salt springs. Okay, let's try this. Okay, so that was a really quick survey of the springs of Volusia County, but Steve had asked me to mainly concentrate on Blue Spring. So it's one of 4 first magnitude springs in the St. John's River Basin, lies within Blue Spring State Park, also lies within the Wekiva Middle St. John's Aquatic Preserve. As such, it's a designated outstanding Florida water, and it's an outstanding Florida spring as designated back in 2016 in the Springs and Aquifer Protection Act. Of just a few other factoids, we've talked first mag, about 9 meters plus depth right over the vent there, a 1/4 mile spring run to the St. John's River. Again, figuratively and literally the centerpiece of Blue Spring State Park, and it's an important warm water refuge for manatees, and we'll come back to that. Again, Todd touched on this concept of spring sheds. Just like a lake or a stream has a watershed, a land area that contributes surface water runoff. In the case of a spring, we have a spring shed, a land area that contributes groundwater recharge that ultimately is expressed coming out of the spring. The spring shed for Volusia Blue Springs, about 100 square miles, mostly in Volusia County. The map here shows topography, with the brown being the higher areas. And you can see these 2 kind of ridge areas running north-south through the spring shed. These are high recharge areas. These are the areas contributing groundwater recharge to the Floridan aquifer, which then comes out in Blue Spring. There's a statement with one of the exhibits in the Lyonia Environmental Center that says manatees love scrub, which is one of the upland plant communities on these ridges. And that's what you get, okay? So that recharge ultimately is expressed in the discharge of Blue Spring. This is mean monthly discharge over a 10-year period. You can see between about 2011 going into 2017, this during a drought, this period of lower discharge. And then over the past several years, discharge has been ramping back up. In part, primarily because we've been getting the tropical weather events, which there was some work done at University of South Florida several years ago, which showed that in much of central peninsular Florida, the main recharge events are the tropical events, the hurricanes, the tropical storms and depressions. We don't like the damage that the wind and the flooding causes, but these are the groundwater recharge events. And then water quality, we've got a couple of little anecdotal historical references to folks who visited Blue Spring. Many of you are probably familiar with William Bartram because of his famous book, Travels. He actually first visited Florida with his father, John Bartram, about 10 years before he came through for the work that resulted in his book. And John Bartram, his dad, in his journal, talks about Blue Spring smelling like bilge water. In other words, the water and that nasty stuff in the bottom of a ship's hull, that would be the hydrogen sulfide. And then some years later, a U.S. Navy survey party on the river, one of the officers on that survey ship kept a journal, and he visited Blue Spring and also describes the strong sulfur smell. So historically, it was more of a sulfur spring. More recent water quality data, fairly high conductivity in dissolved solids because it is a salt spring in that classification. Roughly neutral pH, very low dissolved oxygen. Now most springs are fairly low DO systems, but your typical spring is more like 1 to 2 milligrams per liter or parts per million dissolved oxygen. Blue Spring is a half or less. And in fact, when H.T. Odom visited and sampled a spring back in the 50s, he described it as an anaerobic spring. Elevated nitrate, nitrite, NOx, about 10 times above the what's considered natural background of 0.05 milligrams per liter, and slightly elevated phosphorus. Mainly, I think that's natural because the spring is coming up through the Hawthorne Formation, which is natural phosphorus, which is naturally somewhat enriched in phosphate. Some of the trends over the past 15 years, this is from our most recent status and trends report, an increasing trend for total nitrogen and NOx, nitrate, nitrite, nitrogen, which in a spring are really the same thing. No trend for a number of things, dissolved oxygen, total phosphorus, color, and a decreasing trend for chloride and conductivity. But there is the NOx trend, and that's really the big one that's got a lot of folks worried. And Moira is going to be talking about some of the work being done to try to reverse this trend in her presentation later on in this program. But you can see back in the 70s, Blue Spring was right around that natural background. That's the red line. And then as the spring shed developed, you had that nitrogen loading to the groundwater. And it shows up in the spring. Florida now has a numeric standard for NOx in spring water, 0.35 milligrams per liter. You could see historically, occasionally the spring would get down there, and I'll show you a slide on that why in a minute. But more recently, it's kind of staying up in that elevated range. And again, Moira will talk about what we're doing to try to reverse this. The reason we worry about this, again, as Todd indicated, nitrate is one of the factors driving some of the ecological changes we see in springs, where on the left there, historically, you had a system dominated by the rooted macrophytes, the submerged grass beds, and it's shifted to this benthic filamentous algal mat, which is not as valuable as habitat, not as valuable as a food source. There is evidence that nitrate can be driving this shift. There's actually some pretty good evidence that it's not, but the fact that it's the potential is still, I think, a reason to be working as hard as we can to reduce nitrate loads to the landscape and to the aquifer, to at least eliminate the potential for proliferation of these nuisance macroalgal mats. If nitrate gets high enough, it can be toxic to the spring fauna. It can also actually inhibit the growth of submerged macrophytes. There's evidence for that. And ultimately, some of that is getting to the St. Johns River, where it's causing algal bloom problems. So number of reasons to be working to reduce the loads. There's some interesting relationships between spring flow and water quality. This is total dissolved solids, those dissolved minerals and salts, generally higher at lower spring flows because more of the water is that older relic seawater coming out of the spring. And then at higher spring flows, there's more younger, recently recharged water, which doesn't have as high dissolved solids content. And then kind of get a different trend, higher NOx levels at higher spring flows, because there you're getting the recharge, the rainfall recharge, which is loading the nitrogen down into the groundwater, and then it's coming out of Blue Spring. What this graph tells me is, if we can really get on reducing the nitrate loading to the landscape, we could be seeing improvements in water quality relatively quickly. Not have to wait 20 or 30 years. And then talking some about the ecology of the spring, the natural history. Again, touched on submerged aquatic vegetation communities. Basically, you get two things. You get the rooted macrophytes, the flowering plants, and you get the various groups of algae, the diatoms, the cyanobacteria or blue-green algae, filamentous green algae, and that kind of thing. Characteristic of most of our springs, because of the very clear water, are these dense beds of rooted macrophytes, like you saw in that picture of the Weeki Wachee, or here on the left, the Ishtuckney River. We don't see that in Blue Spring. We just see the algal mats. We do have what I consider to be a fairly reliable anecdotal reference. Dr. Fred Thompson from the Florida Museum of Natural History first sampled snails in Blue Spring in the early 60s, and he references thick growths of aquatic plants, aka these macrophytes in the spring run. I'm not going to get into why they're not there. No, it's not because manatees ate it all, and I don't even think it's because of the nitrate enrichment. And maybe we can get into that in the discussion. Some older data from the Florida Department of Environmental Protection sampling the thin layers of attached algae on the logs and such, mostly diatoms with some green and blue-green algae. The algal mats are mostly the filamentous green and filamentous blue-green algae. This is some relatively recent data. Kirsten Work at Stetson collected some of this, and I've collected some as part of annual surveys of plant cover in Blue Spring. I started those in 2017. This is algal cover expressed as a scale called the Brun-Blanquet scale. 1 is less than 5% cover, 5 is 75 to 100% cover. And you can see we tend to get our highest algal cover generally in that late winter spring period. And then it kind of tails off during the summertime, possibly because of increased grazing. This is measured at 5 sampling transects. 1 is up near the head spring, and 5 is down near the where the spring run goes into the St. Johns. Benthic macroinvertebrates, basically 4 major groups: mollusks, crustaceans like crayfish, various aquatic insect groups, and aquatic worms, the oligochaetes. The mollusks in particular, there's 2 species of snails that, again, this Dr. Fred Thompson described from back in the 60s that are endemic to Blue Spring, found only there and no place else in the world. And I'll come back to that in a bit. The macroinvertebrate community in Blue Spring has always been what we call depauperate, or very low diversity, species poor, because of that very low dissolved oxygen and the high dissolved solids. You know, quote unquote, it's a salty spring. We kind of have seen a declining trend in taxa richness, one measure of the diversity in the invertebrate community, and that might be because of that sustained period of low flow that the spring went through 2011 into 2017, but hopefully maybe our most recent sampling, you know, we're seeing a bit of an increase in that. And then there's been some monitoring of the snail community, and I'll show you some data from that in a little bit, but there's actually a fairly diverse community of freshwater snails in Blue Spring, 27 different taxa in 10 different families. The biggest group are the silt snails, the Hydrobiidae. And again, in green there, the Blue Spring hydrobe, Phaeostracon asthenes, and the pygmy silt snail, Floridobia parva, are endemic to just found in Blue Spring and nowhere else in the world. The two in yellow are notable. Floridobia floridana is a hydrobiid endemic to Florida. And over on the right there, the pluricerid river horn snail, Alemia vanhiningiana, is endemic to the St. Johns River basin. And we do get some exotics. We get two thiarids, and we do get an exotic apple snail. Kirsten thinks it's Palmacia maculata, one of the channeled apple snails. And there's some data. DEP did some sampling back in 2007-08, and then Kirsten Work, under a contract to the district here, has done some sampling in 2014 and again in 2019. This is not really an increasing trend. This is the number of different species or taxa of snails at these different sampling periods. What's going on here is the DEP biologists were a little more conservative. They just identified, say, the snail down to Floridobia. Kirsten spent more time identifying, so she actually pulled out the actual species of Floridobia. So this apparent increase is really more due to increased effort in identifying the different species of snails. But I think it's cool that anywhere from 8 to a dozen or so species of snails in the community at any one time. And actually, one of the single most abundant snails is one of those little endemics, the pygmy silt snail, the Floridobia parva, up to several thousand of these little guys per meter squared from our sampling. Fish, fairly diverse fish community. They're able to move into the spring and out from the St. Johns River. A lot of these fish data have been collected by Missy Gibbs and Kirsten Work at Stetson, and then the park folks have some observations, and there's been some USGS stuff, but probably the largest group of fish are the on the white there, the centrarchids or the sunfish. This is your largemouth bass and bluegill and shellcracker and those kind of guys. Like the benthic invertebrate community, the fish community is heavily influenced by the low dissolved oxygen. This is fish community diversity as the Shannon-Weaver index, H prime, generally higher at higher dissolved oxygen. This is Beecher Spring up here in Putnam County, but the main thing, like Blue Spring, Odom referred to it as an anaerobic spring. And at the head spring areas, the only 3 fish species that you get are those little live bears like the mosquito fish, Gambusia, sailfin molly, and least killifish, because they've got that little upturned mouth that they can breathe right at the water surface where the oxygen is highest. And then the other unique thing about the Blue Spring fish community, as for the St. John's as a whole, is this phenomenon of marine invasions, and the fact that we get these high conductivity salt springs is what enables normally estuarine marine fish to invade far upriver. That's a pod of tarpon. I took that picture in Blue Spring Run a few years ago, and you can see those are tarpon there. Probably everybody you've seen mullet jumping in the run and some of these others. Missy and Kirsten have actually seen snook in the spring run. And then as many of us know, Blue Spring is the primary warm water refuge for the Northeast Florida population of Florida manatee. which is mainly centered on the St. Johns River. And that, I think, has been a real success story. The counts that Wayne Hartley and the park folks and the Save the Manatee Club have done over the years have just shown a phenomenal increase in the manatee population. These are counts they do between October and March, when, you know, the manatees are packing into Blue Spring. The total count, the total number of unique individuals observed over the October to March period, and the highest single day count. And this is all manatees making baby manatees. This is not manatees moving up from South Florida. There's actually very little migration between the different population centers in Florida. So this is all baby manatees. So that's kind of a little overview of where Blue Spring has been, and you know, hopefully where it's going. And again, yeah, thanks for having me. I always enjoy getting down and talking to this Volusia County group.
Thank you very much, Matt. Thank you very much, Rob. That was a great presentation. Appreciate it very much. I have a couple of questions here that I wanted to ask. How does the designation by the EPA of our Volusia Floridan aquifer as a sole source aquifer help us to preserve the integrity of our aquifer from contamination? And does this designation give us any advantage regarding legislation for protection?
Man, I'm going to have to kind of punt on that one. I'm not sure I'm the guy
okay.
to address that. I'm wondering if that's something that that Todd could address, maybe, you know, after we're done.
Okay.
I think the sole source designation, there's still connections with some areas outside of Volusia County, but I guess, you know, that just says we've got to take things like doing the B maps and such seriously. So that would maybe be my take home message there.
Okay, great. I have a more specific question here for your presentation. So the marine invasions of the saltwater fish that you just spoke of, is that an indication of saltwater intrusion or the adaptability of the species of fish, or both?
More the latter, the adaptability of the species of fish. This phenomenon of marine invasions has been known for a long time. I mean, a guy named McLean, who did his PhD dissertation on the fishes of the St. Johns River back in the 40s and the 50s, commented on it. So just again, these you know, salty springs that discharge into the St. Johns is what enables these things to come way upstream. Homosassa over on the Gulf Coast is kind of similar. You get the marine invasions because it's a somewhat saltier type spring.
Great. You spoke a little bit about, I don't know that you spoke about the armored catfish. When I was at Blue Springs, I think a year or two ago, there was a group, I believe from Stetson, spearing the armored catfish in Blue Springs. Is that still ongoing, and are they still a problem?
Yes, they're still a problem. In fact, they've become much more serious a problem because we haven't had the you know, since I guess about 2010, 2011, when we had the real severe freezes. They and some of the other exotics like tilapia have really been expanding in the St. Johns River Basin as a whole. Yeah, as a control measure, Stetson and the park folks did go out and spear them, although I understand now that they actually got smart and now they just come in at night. Where you know, where you can't see them. I know, like at Wekiva too, that, you know, they've had problems with them at Wekiva Spring, and there they tried gill netting them. Like the manatees, they run into the springs in the wintertime as a warm water refuge, and so that's generally when they try to do the control. But yes, they are still a problem, and then probably will be.
And speaking of manatees have been in the news a lot with the die-off and the IRL. So I was surprised to see your graph that showed their increase in population on the manatee count. Has the recent die-off, is that part of that graph, or is it previous data?
It's previous, it's up through the 2019 counting period, which was, late 2019, early 2020. Now, I wasn't able to get the most recent data, although I've seen it, and it hasn't shown the die-off, at least in the St. John's manatees. Although there is a lot of concern because with the sustained high water in the St. John's River, it's lost a tremendous amount of the submerged grasses, particularly like in the Lake George area, Silver Glen Spring, and in the lower St. John's River. We had a conference, a St. John's River Basin Springs conference, and I see Cora can maybe comment on some of that. I think they did see some Indian River Lagoon manatees coming into the St. John's to try to find food.
Okay, great. Well, thanks again for your presentation. Rob, it was really wonderful, and thanks again.